It's really another part of the emotional insights. It's an insight into the workings of emotional life, and that is whatever inner force, energy, or emotion you have not acknowledged within yourself becomes a demon. Demon is a strong word. I'm using the word demon in the sense that it starts to feel like it's a dark force, a dark, tumultuous, problematic force within yourself. I don't mean like a demon necessarily as an entity, but as something that's tumultuous, difficult, dark. Whatever inner force, energy, or emotion which you have not acknowledged within yourself turns into a demon. So if you have anger that you've never acknowledged, you won't admit to yourself that you feel angry, it turns into a dark force. If you have sadness that you've never really acknowledged, that you've never really admitted that you have, then that turns into a dark force. It just becomes a dark force in the sense of the sadness just churns and churns and churns in you. Do you know? If whatever, in spirituality, spiritual kind of personality types are more prone to not acknowledging the more difficult emotional forces within their lives because they're trying so hard to be spiritual or perfect or awakened or enlightened that it's almost like after a while you can't even admit to yourself your own shadow side. That's what we're talking here about, your shadow side. So whatever shadow that you don't acknowledge within yourself turns into a demon, turns into a problematic, conflictatory force within you. That's just one of the laws of your emotional life. If you don't acknowledge what's there will own you. Even if you're denying that it's there, it'll still own you. You won't be able to get away from it, you won't get distance from it, and it will not transform. So I have to begin to acknowledge what we experience. If you do deep enough spiritual work, if your meditation goes deep enough, if your insight goes deep enough, at some point, even if you've visited some very heavenly, beautiful realms, dimensions of being, eventually your shadow side will also reveal itself. At some point, it'll open up. And if you've repressed it your whole life, when it opens up, it can be quite shocking and overwhelming. So, beginning to acknowledge your shadow side, your anger, your resentment, your judgment, your argument with what is, just being able to acknowledge these things, say, yes, okay, it's here within me, and I don't have to judge it anymore. I don't have to pretend like it's not here. That simply by acknowledging it and consciously allowing it to be part of my conscious experience doesn't mean it's going to overwhelm me. In fact, denying it almost ensures that it will overwhelm you at some point, and ensures that it's bubbling out in your experience and behavior anyway the whole time. Often we can find our own shadow side by seeing what we dislike in others. Those traits in someone else that really set you off, that make you angry or resentful or judgmental. Usually the reasons that you're judgmental about certain personality traits or emotional traits in someone else is because they're part of your makeup, but you don't want to see it. You're denying it. You're trying to hide from it. And so you'll repress it, so you won't even really know that you have those traits, but you'll be upset when you see them in others. The reason you're upset is because they're reminding you of something about yourself that you don't want to acknowledge, you don't want to admit to. It can be really quite freeing when you start to see the things you judge most in others are the things you're hiding from most in yourself, that they are a part of you. And as long as you do not acknowledge them, then they are literally running your life, whether you know it or not. In your unconscious mind, they're dictating behavior. They're narrowing your options. So it's really also important just to become honest, just simply to be able to acknowledge whatever is there. I mean, it's important to be able to acknowledge the beauty, too. It's important to be able to acknowledge the love that's there, and clarity that's there, and compassion that's there, and wisdom that's there. Some people have a resistance to acknowledging those forces within themselves. But also it's important to acknowledge the darker qualities that are there. Because if you don't, then they will own you. Right? An interesting thing happens when you start to be able to acknowledge certain shadow emotions, is when you can acknowledge them not only in your mind, it starts there, like, yes, I see that the judgment that I so hate to see in others, I hate to see it because it reminds me that it's in myself. And so, okay, now I will admit that it's in me, and I'll open to it. I'll let myself feel that emotion. I will no longer repress it into my unconsciousness. I'll just admit that I have that within me too, right? Doesn't mean you like it or you want to act on it, but just to admit that it's there and let it arise into conscious awareness. Just let it arise in there and be there. And you'll feel the humbling of giving recognition to something that you might not want to admit is part of you, But emotional health is never found through casting out parts of yourself that you don't want to acknowledge are there. That leads to emotional, illness. We have to admit what's there, but not grasp onto it, not identify with it, not justify it, simply admit that the energy is there. Admit that kind of feeling or reaction is there, right? And this is the interesting thing. When you really start to open up to the dark spaces that you resist even acknowledging, but when you do start to acknowledge them and let them open, eventually when they open, they start to reveal their opposite. So if you have a lot of resentment about something, if you can admit that it's there and open to the experience without getting lost in all your minds, in all the thoughts and everything, and that energy starts to come into your body, and then because you're consciously aware of it, now you're consciously participating in its existence, it allows the experience, the energy to reintegrate into you in a whole way, which means eventually what happens is it flips and you see its opposite. So underneath the anger or the rage, when you finally completely allow it to be and you're not intimidated by it, its other side starts to show up. And often if you have something like a lot of anger, its opposite can be this extraordinary kind of clarity, and sometimes it also arises as a deep kind of compassion. So sometimes people, they say, well, I can't find this clarity thing. I can't find this clarity thing, you see. Well, maybe you need to stop trying to be clear and instead open to the very emotions that you're repressing. Because often when you open to a very chaotic emotion and you're really willing to acknowledge it and you're really willing to just be there as the energy starts to reorient in your system, often that anger or that rage, you start to find its other side, which is a clarity or a sense of love or compassion. Because it was there in the emotion all the time, but as long as you're repressing it, you never get to its other side. All emotions have their other side. They're all part of duality. All emotions have their complementary other side, like the heads and tails on a coin. So anger turns into love or clarity. They're actually bound together. A sense of, can we say, not, just not kind of caring. You're trying to dismiss someone or something, or you feel a real resentment towards them. When you really open to that experience and let the energy reintegrate, then you'll find a deep sense of caring or kindness. So you actually have to do this to start to experience these things. You have to practice it. You have to go into it. You have to take the time. But for the moment, it's this fundamental insight into emotional maturity that whatever inner forces, whatever emotion, whatever energy that you deny, that you have not acknowledged within yourself, becomes a demon, becomes a chaotic force within yourself. Right? So repressed anger becomes the chaotic experience of rage, as an example. So most people, they have certain emotions or feelings or thoughts that they think are kind of dark, that they think that they really wish they didn't have, they don't want to acknowledge, and so they try not to acknowledge them. And it leads to more inner chaos. It just leads to more conflict. But it's humbling to really be able to admit the fullness of your humanity, right? Everything that's there. The heavens, the hells, the lights, the angels, the demons, the good, the not so good. Being able to acknowledge it all. And finally letting those forces begin to be experienced in a clear way. Be experienced, because this is the key to so much emotional maturing work. It's simply to remain conscious without going into a commentary, without going into a judgment, without going into a story. Simply remain conscious as difficult emotions arise in your experience. And if you haven't before you get used to this, it takes some real discipline, because you will want to get in there and justify them or argue or get going in the old stories and everything. You'll want to do that because that's the tendency, that's the conditioned way. So in a certain sense, you're moving against the stream. Your emotional reactivity is going this way and you're moving upstream. You're not just going, you're moving upstream. So I think these two things, about our arguments with what is, and the way that we try to hide from and deny our own shadows. Sometimes people are afraid of acknowledging their shadow side because they think if they do, then it will start to manifest. Well, if you're denying it, I guarantee you it's already manifesting. There's no such thing as successful repression. There really isn't. You can repress an emotion, hold it down, but its energy is going to leak out in a different form. It might change form as it leaks out, but it's going to come out in a different form, a form that's a bit more acceptable to you. So ultimately, there's no successful repression, because it always leaks out. You never really get the lid on everything completely. It just doesn't work that way. And when you can finally acknowledge and experience all this from the still point within you, not as a means of hiding from it, that's a mistake a lot of people make. They try to utilize the clear space of awareness as a place to hide from their humanity, hide from their emotions, hide from their upset, instead of using the ground of their being, using the clearness of awareness as a foundation from which you meet and allow to arise whatever is there. See, there's a difference. Because when you're allowing something to arise, what happens, you have this strange paradoxical experience starts to come upon you, which is there's a feeling of intimacy, a closeness with what's arising, but also a profound non-attachment. So there's a detachment and intimacy together. That's what you're looking for. Kind of detachment, but total intimacy. Not the kind of detachment that's just away from and apart from what's arising, but the kind of detachment that can be a part of what's arising without getting stuck in it. You see? So it's kind of a paradoxical experience when it first comes upon you. You will feel really close to what's arising because you're not trying to run away from it, and strangely you'll also feel non-attached to it. When you're in your center, when you're in some contact with the ground of your being. And this is the whole key. This is the difference of doing this approach to more emotional work, is because we're using the ground of our being, the foundation of our own existence, as the ground from which all this work is done. Often a lot of emotional work is done simply from the standpoint of the emotions. And you just get lost and lost and lost and lost and lost. And you may have cathartic breakthroughs, but then you tend to give yourself a week or two, you're right back where you started from. If there's no touching into the ground of being, we're not really touching into the resource that harmonizes all these energies and forces within ourselves, that integrates them. So that's why I'm combining these two types of work, the ground of being and opening to one's emotional experience.